I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Our guest today works alongside the New Mexico community of Picuris Pueblo, one of the smallest and oldest indigenous groups in the United States. A recent study published in Nature establishes a clear ancestral link between Picuris Pueblo and the ancient peoples of Chaco Canyon. The discovery represents a landmark in archaeological genetics, not just for its scientific findings, but for the way the research was conducted, which was at the invitation of the tribe, under their direction and with their sovereignty over the process being fully respected. We discuss why archaeology is a continuous process of reckoning with history, and how to move forward in meaningful partnership with Native communities. It all depends on changing not just our methods, but our mindset. It was such a pleasure for me to talk with our guest today, Dr. Adler, because I learned and was inspired to want to visit these locations and see them myself in person. I haven't spent that much time in the U.S. Southwest, and so I would love to be able to go there one day. But let's get started with the conversation. Dr. Adler, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Mike Adler. I'm the chair of the Anthropology Department and associate professor of anthropology here at Southern Methodist University. I am very curious about how people constitute their past, how identity comes about.
And can you tell me about your recent study in Nature?
The recent publication in Nature was the culmination of several years of collaborative work with Picuris Pueblo, which is an amazing community of Puebloan people living in the northern Rio Grande, very curious about their own ancestry, about their place in both the ancestral Pueblo world as well as today's world. And so what we fashioned with their guidance, and it really came from Picuris and was driven by Picuris, was a study to look at their genomic ancestry, their genetic ancestry, to try and better understand whether they had and to what extent they had genetic ties to one of the most important archaeological parts of the American Southwest, a place called Chaco Canyon, which 1,000 years ago was the center of a very large regional religious and economic system. And the remains of the Chacoan peoples in northwestern New Mexico draw tens of thousands of visitors a year. Picuris, being very small, with kind of a fractured oral tradition, wanted to know to what extent they were related. And the results of the research show a very clear genetic relationship between Picuris and those buried in Pueblo Bonito.
Tell me, I think, more about that, because the study was also unique because of the way that you engaged with the tribe.
Yeah, so Picuris Pueblo is a community. It's a village that's federally recognized as an indigenous, native nation. So they go by the Picuris Pueblo tribal nation. And it numbers around 300 people. So it is the smallest Pueblo community. It was a unique study in that it was Picuris Pueblo reaching out to us to try and ascertain whether they could know more about who they were related to over the past thousands of years in the Southwest and across the nation, for that matter. And so it was unexpected. Most tribes, Native American nations in the U.S., are rightfully so quite reticent to do genetic ancestral work for a number of reasons. We have a really bad track record as anthropologists in collaborating equally with tribes. We say we're going to collaborate, and then we go do our own thing. And Picuris was very adamant that they run the research, and the entire research process they had, and they continue to have complete sovereignty over what is being done and what has been done. So um, they approached me. I work with Dr. David Meltzer here at SMU, who collaborates with Dr. S.K. Villerslev in Copenhagen, SK being one of the foremost ancient DNA experts in the world.
How do these results now help the community? I mean, it seems like they were very pleased to hear that there is a connection, but is there also more than just that?
Yeah, in fact, one of the somebody who commented on the research, not someone associated with the research, basically kind of said what you just said. Now that you've caught the car, what do? You know, that old trope about, you know, a dog catching a car. Um, what this does is it provides really strong evidence for why Picuris Pueblo needs to be involved in a lot of the discussions about Chaco Canyon. This, the area that we call Chaco Canyon, has a lot of energy development around it, and it is a pretty contentious landscape in terms of politics and economy and energy. And Picuris felt like they had not really had a seat at the table as a group that claimed affiliation with Chaco Canyon. So this allowed them to say, we have oral traditions that intimate that we have relationships to this place, but now we have genetic evidence, which, as we all know, sort of in the court of law, in the scientific community, the legal community, is one of the strongest lines of evidence that people depend upon for knowing what past relationships existed.
Yes. And I mean, it's really such a beautiful site, the Chaco Canyon. I mean, I haven't ever been there, but looking at the photos, it is incredible.
Yeah, Chaco Canyon. Sorry to interrupt, but it's obviously, as an archaeologist, it's a place that that has a lot of mystery that still surrounds it. Um, Not mystery about where they went, not mystery about where they came from, but more what drove people to build these astounding masonry edifices to belief and to identity. And so that being the case, the, all Pueblo tribes claim ancestry in Chaco Canyon, and they're all correct. This is not Picuris saying we're the only ones related to Chaco Canyon. In fact, they say the exact opposite. We want to assert this knowledge so that we can have a seat at the table, and with our fellow Pueblo communities, help protect this place and help get people aware of what an astounding legacy the Puebloan and other indigenous groups have in the southwestern United States.
What are things that you've learned from the communities that you've worked with? Like, I mean, would you say that you're most knowledgeable about Picuris Pueblo?
What have I learned? I've learned that humility and the fact we know very little needs to always be the mantle you wear when you work with indigenous communities. Um, Again, realize these are communities that have been through and continue to experience, I'm sorry to use the term, genocide, um, and concerted efforts to try and acculturate and homogenize, these groups so that they become less of separate nations than they actually are. What I've learned as well is that what we think we know is minuscule. When I started working with the remains of Picuris's ancestry at our campus, I was pretty sure we had a pretty good read on how old they were, how large the Pueblo was, their ancestry. I've shown myself wrong very, very adeptly many times. Picuris continues to have astounding surprises. Um, the oral tradition was that there were thousands of people at Picuris Pueblo. I was very hesitant to believe that until I started looking at the archaeology. It was a massive cosmopolitan center before Spanish contact in the 14 and 1500s. It had far-reaching exchange networks that went out onto the American plains, all the way to Amarillo, Texas, and all the way to the coast of the Pacific coast. And it had an oral tradition that had been fragmented and suffered the depopulation of the Pueblo. So there was knowledge, but it was oftentimes, by their own account, very fragmentary. And so it's been a fascinating journey to try and respect all voices. Archaeology is not in a position, or should it be in a position, of verifying oral traditions. We are yet a different voice, if you will, a different perspective on the past. And so, understanding that oral traditions are not myths, they're not stories, they are very, very important, cohesive understandings of the past that communities use to understand themselves and understand others. Archaeology is just one more voice, I think, a complementary voice, but not one that should be there to test whether an oral tradition is true or not. That's something that archaeology is still learning, I think.
Were there specific aspects of the process that were challenging because of that kind of need to work with them?
Yeah, there were multiple challenges in this research. The first being, ancient DNA research requires the destruction of human bone. There are other ways to get genetic material, but the most common is the actual destruction of human bone. It's only 1/20th of a teaspoon, but yet it's destructive. And though a lot of indigenous groups do not want any invasive work done on their ancestors. So that was a challenge. Making sure that the community knew that their ancestors would be sampled. The other challenge too is that when we uh, brought forward the part of the research that involved uh, the living to give saliva samples, that was also a challenge because um, you have these outsiders coming around we worked with our tribal liaison, Richard Mermejo, coming to one's house and saying, can you give a sample of your saliva? That's can be unsettling to someone who isn't familiar with the process, the techniques, the goals. And so that took a long time, rightly so, because it's a trust relationship, and we had to not only build trust, but also involve the trust of our tribal liaison, our tribal collaborators. And in a small community, people do know each other's business, and people do assess whether they want to be part of something. So that was a challenge, as it should be.
What are aspects of the Picuris Pueblo community that you've learned or through this research study that you think would be really interesting to help others, maybe far away outside of this field, become more curious about them?
Picuris is it's a national treasure. I'll just put it out there. It's a place with an incredibly deep history, with a group that has weathered centuries of um, depopulation and forms of genocide and uh, interactions with both indigenous and non-indigenous groups. This research, the genetic research, is actually part of a much larger project that some colleagues and I have entered into with Picuris. Um, the Picuris have one of the most astounding prehistoric agricultural landscapes I've ever seen. Um, there were thousands of people there prior to Spanish contact who were terracing hillsides and creating what we call grid gardens. These rainfall-fed agricultural fields that would have fed thousands of people and possibly, likely, I would say, overproduced to produce goods that were being traded with other groups. So it's a place that has a long cosmopolitan history that um, is unexpected, because when you walk into Picuris today and see the few hundred people who live there, and none of the remains of their ancestral homes, because they built of adobe. If they had built of stone like they did in Chaco or they did in Mesa Verde, Picuris Pueblo would be a national park.
Mm-hmm.
It would be it would be something that you would see on the national park list, because it melted. It's invisible archaeologically. So it has a great deal to continue to teach us about. And we always need to be ready to be surprised. If we're not, that curiosity has got to be there.
And you mentioned a little bit about the agriculture and their ability, I guess, to farm and is that something that, like they had techniques that could be used today that would be helpful?
Yes, you hit a really important topic. How can Picuris teach us about what we might do today? These agricultural fields that they created did several things. They were lined with stones, which gather heat during the day. Realize Picuris Pueblo is above 7,000 feet above sea level. So it is about as high as you can go and still do corn and beans and squash agriculture. So they perfected means to trap heat, the heat radiates during the night, to trap moisture, to infiltrate soil with necessary moisture. As our world gets more arid and more variable in terms of our weather patterns and our precipitation patterns, yes, they have a great deal to teach us. These are relatively simple but incredibly resilient systems that we now see across the world in other areas where people have had to contend with drought, with aridity. So Picuris did an amazing job in harnessing and harvesting water, which in the American Southwest is probably the limiting factor.
So are there groups or agricultural groups that are looking at indigenous means and ways of addressing issues that maybe current farmers are having?
Yes, I mean, I think that there are a lot of smallholder farmers in that part of the Southwest that are using similar techniques to try and preserve water and soil and um, heat for the growth of plants. It certainly hasn't gone to the industrial level. I don't know that it could, but yes, there are groups that are not only looking at these indigenous farming techniques, but also looking at the heritage, at the seeds used by indigenous groups, seeds and strains of corn and other plants that are drought resistant, that are resistant to some of the microbes that are out there, that diversify our crops. A lot of people are working locally and at a smaller scale on these questions of diversity and uh, farming techniques.
That's another, I guess, aspect of the genetics of the seeds.
You actually hit on one of our next and ongoing projects with Picuris. S.K. Villerslev and his amazing innovations with ancient DNA is now being all of these innovations are now being applied to what's called environmental DNA, where in some soil conditions, DNA of plants and animals is very readily acquired and studied. And so one of the things that we have talked to Picuris about is taking soil samples from these fields and seeing what was grown there. Plants, animals, everything on the landscape leaves genetic signatures. And if the preservation is right, you get a fingerprint of what animals and plants were there. We don't know what they were growing on these amazing terraces that mark the hillsides all around Picuris. Are they late? Is it wheat that they're growing after the Spanish bring wheat and barley? Is it corn? Is it another species of plant, a wild plant that they're cultivating? With genetics, we can hopefully fathom some of that. So that's some of the next avenues that are available to Picuris. Again, if it's a question that they want to answer.
Are there any questions that I haven't asked you that you would like to respond to?
Do I hope that other tribal communities embrace this sort of research? I would say that I hope this research has set a good model. And this is a model, it's not just what we have done with Picuris. Other researchers are doing this as well. It's a model for collaboration that puts the tribes in control. If there are benefits that could accrue from this sort of research, I hope other tribal nations consider this. And I completely agree if they walk away and say, no, we don't want to be part of this because of some of the dangers of doing this sort of research. I certainly understand that. But there are powerful tools out there that I think, if pursued by tribal nations with full sovereignty, might benefit. And so, hopefully there's a wider consideration out there that trust can be form the basis for these sort of collaborations, and that if the questions can be answered and the community is willing to collaborate, there's some great partnerships that will be there in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Adler. I really appreciate our conversation, learning so much from you.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.